Hello, this is Valerian Magatsu, and today is part 4 of learning psychology. Today we're going to be talking about classical conditioning. So first of all, we need to learn our associations and pairings, terminology, measures, and the type of trials that are basically used in classical conditioning. So, learning via association. Learning in classical conditioning is achieved by association, how things are paired. Basically, learning to associate two stimuli that have been paired together. One stimuli elicits/causes a response. So, let's see here, okay? We've got the neutral stimuli, which would be a metronome, the food, which would be an unconditioned stimulus, elicits an unconditioned response. So this is kind of the building blocks of classical conditioning. So now that the metronome is paired with the food, the subject now knows that the metronome is going to mean food, which will in return cause salivation in a dog. Okay. Classical conditioning, it's best to do your metronome before your food. So keep the metronome ticking, and it will, in return, start to condition the stimulus. So now the metronome by itself will actually continue to create salivation. So unconditioned is unlearned, conditioned is learned. It is best that the stimulus to be learned occurs before the stimulus that elicits the reaction. Through pairing, the once neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. Conditioned stimulus and conditioned response chain is thus a learned reflex or a conditioned reflex. Most stimuli are external. So, these are things in your environment, essentially. So, we have important questions that need to be learned in terms of how the stimuli is external. What was learned or conditioned? What was innate? Unlearned or unconditioned? What is the stimulus? These are important questions to ask yourself when conditioning. And what is the response? So basically, what was the original reflex? What was learned or conditioned? What was innate? What was the stimulus, or which is the stimulus? And which is the response? What's the conditioned stimulus, and what's the unconditioned response? These are questions you should be asking yourself to help understand how it's operating, or how you're conditioning whatever animal or person you're conditioning. So, the food needs to be paired with an associated sound of the metronome. The result is the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus. The metronome basically sounds the representation, and it presents the conditioned stimulus. So NS becomes CS. How do we know this change occurred? Well, one of the best ways you could do this is by seeing if the saliva comes before the actual food is presented. So you have the metronome, and maybe you measure the saliva as soon as the metronome comes on. Before the food is fully presented. You could do a test trial with just the metronome and see if it's drilling before food. So here's how a graph would look in terms of what you should be seeing. We'll have the metronome going, as in time. So food comes, you have a peak here, and then the salivation comes with it as well as the metronome goes in time, right? So at first, the metronome comes, and you get a peak of salivation. Now, later in time, the metronome comes and the peak comes earlier, because now the animal has been conditioned to respond to the metronome. So you're going to get a bigger peak, more salivation, and the dog's going to be more ready for food, essentially. So just so you don't get confused, we have learned is conditioned, unlearned is unconditioned, US is unconditioned stimulus, UR is unconditioned response, CS is conditioned stimulus, CR is conditioned response, NS is neutral stimulus, produces no specific response. So this will always be where you start. You have a neutral stimulus. Learned, conditioned reflex, association, pairing. Essentially all interchangeable. So to see how basically you have to apply measures so an experiment's legitimate. So you have the percentage of the CRs, so percentage of conditioned response, which is, you measure for, 68 out of 100 times drooling. How many times are you seeing the drooling? Magnitude of the conditioned response. What is the amount of saliva that's being produced? Whether it be saliva, it's a directly measurable component. And, more training equals more drool. This is percentage, magnitude. You should both increase. You should see more of it. That's important. It's an important distinction. Direct physiological responses, which is changes in heart rate, blood pressure, muscular tension. This is also very helpful. You'll see these as well. You see peaks, and if this is good for lab work, you need to see these direct changes in saliva levels. These are all measurable. Now, the indirect measurements would be if you need to get results that are it's not as easy to get results. So sometimes it's easier to get indirect measurements, which would be a avoidance, approach, at the sign of a CS. So for example, if you were measuring to see how much fear is in the animal even whether it be a shock or maybe an association between a stimulus that's negative, that means a bad thing. There's a lot of different ways, but it's indirect. It's more like avoidance. You're looking for avoidance, or maybe an animal escaping an enclosure, or jumping over a barrier. You're just kind of seeing an entire, almost like a fixed action pattern. So there's two types of trials. There's the conditioning trial, which is basically your training trial or your regular trial. These are other names for it. And you need to pair a conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. And you could basically see the entire association between the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus. Typically associate one with another. Your test trial, in which the conditioned stimulus is presented alone. Metronome ticking by itself. Let's see if the animal is reacting to this. This is just a test. And usually these are paired in 1 for every 10 trials. So 1 out of 10, or 1 for every 16 trials. And you wanna mix it up. Too much consistency is not as great. So typically present 1 test trial among every 10 conditioning trials or so. But like I said, do it randomly. And remember that latency decreases the more time you pair. So, yeah. So we went over associations and pairings, terminology, measures, and the types of trials that are used in classical conditioning. Now, most importantly, as you read, I find it important to review all of these. The terminology is really important as you read psychology. So definitely learned, unlearned, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response, neutral stimulus, and remember that these are interchangeable. Learned, conditioned reflex, association, pairing. Thank you very much. More videos will be up soon.